Greeting everyone, aloha, and welcome to the Center for Chinese Studies webinar series at UH Maloa. My name is Wensong Wang. I'm a moderator and organizer of this series, and I teach Minqing China in the History Department. First of all, on behalf of the CCS, I'd like to wish you a very happy and healthy Chinese Lunar New Year, Year of the Tiger, 新春快乐 虎年安康. Today's presentation and the dialogue is about Jose Rizal, the celebrated icon and national hero of Philippines, as well as the controversy over his Chinese ancestry. Starting from the 16th century, many born on the southeast coast of China sailed across the sea to settle down in what is now Philippines. They and their descendants became symbols of the time-honored historical link and complicated relations between the two countries. The most important example is Jose Rizal, whose literary and political writings inspired the Philippine Revolution and ultimately led to his execution by the Spanish colonizers in 1896. However, many Filipino people still don't know Rizal's Chinese ancestry. Many others don't want to talk about it or even deny it. Why? How to make sense of this complicated figure, as well as his contemporary implications for our rejections of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian attitude in general, which are on the rise in the West during the pandemic. We are very lucky to have a great expert on this very timely topic, Professor Pia Arboleda, with us today. She will be making a presentation and also having a conversation with Dr. Min Baoyu. Before I introduce the two speakers, I would like to thank you all, especially our guest of honor, Dr. Arboleda, for joining us. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce the hardworking team of the CCS staff members led by current director, Professor Min Baoyu, Associate Director, Dr. Cindy Ning, and the Program Coordinator, Ms. Jianing Sun. During this session, if you have any questions about technical or logistical issues, please use the chat forum that will be monitored and answered by Dr. Lin and Ms. Sun. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Center for Philippine Studies, the Department of Indo-Pacific Languages and Literatures, as well as the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature. We would like to thank and acknowledge our co-sponsors for their support. Please know that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to the CCS YouTube channel, where you can also find the recordings of some of our previous events. We are also on Instagram and Facebook. Please follow us to get the latest news and updates. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two distinguished speakers today. First, Pia Arboleda. She is Associate Professor and Chair of the Indo-Pacific Languages and Literatures Department, also recipient of the 2015 Regents Medal for Excellence in Teaching. She holds a Doctor of Arts degree in Language and Literature, a Master's degree in Filipino Language and Literature, and a Bachelor of Science in Commerce and Marketing from De La Salle University. Before joining UH, she served as visiting professor at Osaka University and assistant professor at University of Philippines. She is currently the director of the Center for Philippine Studies at UH. Our second speaker is Min Baoyu, who is the CCS director. It's great to have two directors with us today. We are very glad to see this kind of close collaboration between different regional centers at UH. Dr. Yu received her degree from Beijing University and Stanford University and teaches in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature at UH. She has published widely in the area of 20th century Chinese literature, film, and culture, and her current research focuses on the concept of Chinese diaspora and its representation in literature and film. In terms of format, Dr. Arboleda will first speak for about 45 minutes, then Dr. Yu will engage her in a brief conversation before we launch into our Q&A session. At any time during the presentations, we invite the audience to use the Q&A forum instead of the chat function to send comments or questions, which we will monitor and present to our speakers after their presentation. Please do not wait to send your question until the very end, because then we might run out of time to answer them. We will try to take the questions in the order they have been submitted, but sometimes we have to synthesize or group them together due to time limitation. Please excuse me if I mispronounce your name when presenting your question. After today's presentation, we will send out a brief survey to our audience, and we would greatly appreciate if you could take a minute or two to give us some feedback. So without further ado, let me turn over first to Professor Arboleda.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the Center for Chinese Studies, Professor Mingbao Yue, Wenxiang, Cindy Jialing for organizing this lecture. And thank you, obviously, to Clement Montero and Fred Magdalena of the Center for Philippine Studies. I would like to begin today's sharing session with a bit of trivia. My husband's grandfather, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, was the first Filipino flag officer of the Philippine Navy. Its current headquarters is named after him, the Naval Station Jose V. Andrada. An antique collector who happened to be a friend of Jose Rizal's sister Trinidad pawned part of his Rizaliana collection to Commodore Andrada. These items were never redeemed and are still in the care of the Andrada family. One day, over the dinner table with my in-laws, the conversation shifted to the Rizaliana collection since the display cabinet was in the dining room. I don't know what came over me, but I happened to mention that Rizal was Chinese. My comment was first met with laughter. Perhaps they thought I was joking. Then with disbelief when they realized I was serious. My father-in-law then exclaimed in Filipino, ay ibenta na lang natin yung Rizaliana. Chinese naman pala si Rizal. Roughly translated, it meant, in that case, let's just sell the Rizaliana because Rizal being Chinese. For him, it was probably unthinkable that the Philippine national hero was not even Filipino in quotation marks, and I will explain that later. This attitude is not uncommon. Most Filipinos react the same way when I tell them that Rizal was Chinese. This was not at all discussed in my history class. If I didn't need to teach a course on Rizal here at UH, I myself would not have known this. My paper aims to review critical and often conflicting perspectives on Rizal and his ancestry, to dispel misconceptions about Rizal that average Filipinos have, to confront anti-Chinese sentiments among Filipinos, and to present my own reflection on Jose Rizal. So just as a warning, I am not a historian. I approach these issues as a lover of literature and as a teacher of the Rizal course. I will, however, draw upon Schumacher's work as well as the work of other historians. The best way for me to provide a background on Chinese in the Philippines is to provide you with this map and lots of pictures. This is a map of Manila. And I quote from an article entitled El Pueblo Chino del Parian, when Martin de Goiti first reached Manila in June 1570, there was a community of 40 Chinese and 20 Japanese living in the city. Few immigrants lived here permanently because most would usually just anchor their junks or Chinese merchant ships at the bay during trading season. After the galleon trade was launched from Manila, a great influx of Chinese merchants had settled in the city. The very first Parian was established in 1581. First, it was within this area. The walls of Intramuros were built in 1592. So when the walls were built, they were asked to move outside of these walls, and they lived in this area. And later on, if they integrate if they convert to Christianity or intermarry, then they are allowed to move to the Binondo area in this section of the map. So more current version of this map from 1898 shows Binondo over here, San Nicolas. This area is now where the Manila Post Office is. And this is the Intramuros area. I will show a few pictures. So just so we can envision what it was like at that time. So it's not the crowded Manila that we know, but these were how the streets looked. This is a sample of the Chinese merchant ships. So Manila was a port city, and this is a photo from circa 1896. This was Escolta in 1899, lots of calesa or horse-driven carriages. And this was the Philippine Post Office, built in 1912. So this was after Rizal had died, but it's good to see it. This is the gateway to Fort Santiago, or that walled city. A very important structure was Ateneo because this was where Rizal had studied. And in his, if you watch the movie, Jose Rizal, that was starring Cesar Montano, when he walked from his jail cell, he looked at the structures around him, and then the character in that movie said, "Oh, the Ateneo, I spent many wonderful years there." So this was that photo. This is a photo of Ateneo. This is the jail cell where he had stayed from November 3rd to December 29th, and where he wrote Mi Ultimo Adios, his last work. Luneta is not the crowded structure that it is today. It looked like this. This is the place where he was going to be executed. Here is a photo of Rizal's execution. Rizal was executed by Indios who were asked to fire upon him, and behind the line of the Indios were Spanish soldiers ready to fire in case they would not be able to perform the job. Rizal, when Rizal was executed, at first they couldn't find his body, and later on they found his body in the Paco Cemetery. After the flags were after the flags changed, when the Americans took over, they were able to exhume, so this is the grave of Jose Rizal. When they found the place where he was buried, they marked it with Jose Protasio Rizal. In the old days, they would do it from left to right. After a while, they were exhumed his body, and this is his mother, Teodora Alonso, holding Rizal's skull. Later on, his remains were transferred to the monument where to the monument in Luneta Park. This is a sample of a Rizal Day celebration in 1913. They had declared Jose Rizal's death as a national commemoration day. This is a photo of the monument in 1940. As a note, it is important for us to remember that there was a social hierarchy at that time. The Peninsulares were at the top of that hierarchy. These were the Spaniards born in Spain, living in the Philippines. The Insulares were Spaniards born in the Philippines. When they returned to Spain, they are referred to as Filipino. So at that time, the only Filipinos were the Spaniards born in the Philippines. There were Spanish mestizos, Spaniards of mixed blood. The Indios, the native peoples, were called Indios, and I will return to this point later on. The Chinese were outsiders, so technically they didn't belong to any of these categories. When I was taught history, they said, okay, they're the ones that are even below the Indios, if they are mentioned at all. Now, a brief background about the Noli Makan, because part of the reason why I think we are confused about Rizal's ancestry is because of our interpretation of this novel. So the term itself came from the Bible, and this was a scene where when Jesus Christ had first appeared after his resurrection, and then he said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father." So the idea of touch me not came from this verse from the Bible. Most of the time when I teach the Noli, I use Soledad Lacson Locsin's translation, English translation. But the most accessible to us is Derbyshire's The Social Cancer, and I like the translation of Virgilio Almario in Filipino. So the Noli and the Fili are satirical novels, and the main character is Ivara, Crisostomo Ivara. Crisostomo Ivara's father was buried in a cemetery, and one of the friars had his body exhumed, and because he was called a heretic, and the orders were for his body to be transferred to the Chinese cemetery, which are in the margins. But rather than bury his body in the Chinese cemetery, they threw the body into the river. So I will show an excerpt from the Noli Makan series that I translated. The whole series is available for anyone who is interested to watch them. Could you tell me if you hear the sound? Is the sound okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oops. Let me go back. Oops.
Tunay na ito na nga si Crisostomo, anak ni Don Rafael Ivara. Mababanag pa ba ninyo ang binatilyong lumisan ng mahabang panahon?
7 taon. Marahil ay nakalimutan mo na ang iyong bansa.
Manapay kabaliktaran. So, bayan kong nakalimot sa akin.
Anong ibig mong sabihin?
1 taon akong hindi tumanggap ng balita mula rito.
Ituturing kong malaki.
Namatay ang iyong ama sa bilangguan. Ipinakanulo ng kanyang pinakamatalik na kaibigan at tinaligdan ng ibang walang gulugod na katulad ko. Naway, mapatawad ng Diyos.
Hindi ko ito matatanggap ng gano'n na lamang.
Makinig ka sa akin. Huwag mong isipin maghiganti. Nabigo ko sa pagtatanggol sa iyong ama. Pero walang nawala sa akin. Isa akong Kastila. Opisyal ng hukbo. Heredero ka man. Mistiso ka lang. Wala kang ganoong karapatan. Ang payo ko, kilalanin mo iyong sarili.
So there, it is understandable that we think that Ivara is Jose Rizal because of the many similarities that we see from his life and the character in the novel. So both of them are part of the Ilustrado class, educated in Europe. They knew many languages. They had reformist views. They were in favor of assimilation. And there was the love interest, the girl who got away. For Jose Rizal, it was Leonor Rivera. And for Ivara, it was Maria Clara. Both of them did not get the woman of their dreams. But there are also, so here is an excerpt from Soledad Lacson Locsin when Ivara entered when Ivara first arrives. So it was, the dialogue was the same in the video. So I have the honor of introducing you to Don Crisostomo Ivara. A gentleman recently arrived from Europe. There was nothing striking about him other than his black suit in the midst of the gathering, his commanding height, his features, his movements exuded an aura of wholesome youthfulness. One could see in his frank and pleasant visage some slight change of Spanish blood. So there are differences between Ivara and Jose Rizal. Ivara is Spanish mestizo. He was tall, and I will return to this point later. And he's the richest man in their town, and they were landowners. Jose Rizal is predominantly Chinese, and he is only 4'11". He comes from a family of inquilinos or rich tenants. An inquilino is a laborer indebted to a landlord who allows him to form a farm. So when Domingo Lamco, Rizal's Chinese ancestor, had come to Binyan, the average holding of an inquilino was 2.9 hectares. After Rizal's father had moved to Calamba Hacienda, the Rizal family in the 1890s rented from the Hacienda over 390 hectares. So the original lease would be to an inquilino, usually Chinese mestizos, who would then sublet it to a kasama or the share tenants. So Rizal's family was rich, but Ivara's family is the richest in their town. So there's a big difference between being an inquilino and a landowner. Then there's the issue of the ancestry. So because we want to see Ivara as Rizal, we want also to believe that Rizal is Chinese, is a mestizo, is a Spanish mestizo. But looking at his paternal ancestor tree, there is no evidence of him being of Spanish descent. So his great grandparents first arrived from China, and Domingo Lamco was baptized and chose the name Domingo, meaning Sunday. And also it was a practice at that time to take the name of your sponsor, or like your ninong or ninang, your godparents. So Domingo Lamco and this man, Agustin Chinco, became business partners, and Domingo Lamco married his youngest daughter, Ines de la Rosa. So there was a big age gap between Domingo Lamco and Ines de la Rosa. Their son was Francisco Mercado, and their son after that is Juan Mercado. Juan Mercado became a government official, and during this time, he was responsible for ensuring that all people change their name or adopt a Spanish name. So in this family tree, we find no evidence of Spanish ancestry. Then we look at his maternal ancestor tree, and none of these are, so Gregorio Alonso was also Chinese, and according to some of the accounts, he was the one who looked most Chinese, keeping his pigtail, and this ancestor Mariquita Ursua may have been the one with some Malay or Spanish heritage, but the records are not very clear about that. So mostly in Rizal's maternal side, their heritage is also predominantly Chinese. Before I go into the discussion on Rizal's anti-Chinese sentiments, I would like to also discuss a few of the critical readings on Rizal. The next two slides are from Nick Joaquin's A Question of Heroes, and I summarize the points here that were given by two scholars. The first is Leon Maria Guerrero, and these are some of the main highlights of his reading of Rizal from the First Filipino, published in 1961. Guerrero's sister, Carmen Guerrero, was married to Ismael Cruz, who is the grandson of Maria Rizal Cruz, who is Rizal's sister. So according to Guerrero, Rizal's privileged position as a middle-class intellectual dictated his fate. So he grew up with a yaya and a private tutor. His father owned a big library. His mother was educated and taught him to read and speak Spanish. When Rizal identified himself as Indio, he became a symbol for the people, and he would have been elected as a representative of the Spanish Cortes had he been alive. So Guerrero's conclusion was, given Rizal's advantages, it was but natural for him to succeed. However, Ante Radaic from 1963, from his text Rizal from Within, used a different framework to look at his life. According to Radaic, Rizal's height was the source of his inferiority complex. In his diary, he refers to Segunda Kadikbak suitor as un hombre alto, so a tall man. This was also the description of that he gave to Crisostomo Ivara, his commanding height. Therefore, he imbued Ivara with characteristics that he had wanted for himself. Furthermore, Radaic says he did not marry Nelly Boasted because she might think he was after her money. He did not get seriously involved with any woman because he was, in quotation, married to his country. His sister Narcissa remarks that his head was too big and his body frail. To compensate for these weaknesses, he got into bodybuilding and fencing. He was constantly being teased by his schoolmates and even by his elder sisters. His reply was, "When I die, people will keep pictures and statues of me." And some oral history accounts also say that he was practicing falling because he anticipated that he was going to face the firing squad one day. But we are not sure of that account, if he really practiced falling. Now, I would like to discuss Alfonso Ang's Rizal's Chinese overcoat. This particular text talks about Rizal's anti-Chinese sentiment. Alfonso Ang cites three things as the basis for his observation. This is a direct quote. The drooling Chinaman in the lower deck of the Tabo, the Vapor Tabo, the opening scene of the El Filibusterismo, the wailing Chinese vendor being abused by school children, the Chinese trader who was sued by Rizal for exploiting Filipinos. Are these not enough to reflect the emotional contradictions between Rizal and the Chinese? So, Alfonso Ang uses the character of Quiroga to explain Rizal's Chinese sentiment. This is a quote from his text. Artificial in manner, hypocritical, cunning, a bootlicker of government officials engaging in business speculations, intent on nothing but profit, such was Rizal's portrayal of Quiroga. Alfonso Ang thinks that this character is Carlos Palanca. But we should remember that Rizal's characters are a mixture of many real people, and whether or not it was based on Carlos Palanca it may be partly based on Carlos Palanca and maybe not. But Alfonso Ang himself points out that even if he based it on Carlos Palanca, this man who became the first Chinese consul of the Philippines was not entirely, let me read it. It should be noted that Rizal's derision of this man who became the first Chinese consul of the Philippines was not entirely without basis, because history clearly records Palanca's involvement in disreputable businesses like opium, and there was and his monopoly of cockfighting arenas, or the Tagalog sabungan. So perhaps Rizal was not criticizing Quiroga's Chinese ancestry, but his behavior. This is picture that Alfonso Ang provides, showing opium addicts in the Binondo den. So this may have contributed to the negative image of the Chinese, according to his article. Then he continues to say, Rizal was truly anti-Chinese in both word and deed. In a letter to his mother, he had written, I had a lawsuit with the Chinese and I vowed not to buy any more from them, so that sometimes I find myself very hard up. Now we have almost neither dishes nor tumblers. So that was in 1895 while he was exiled in Dapitan in Mindanao in southern Philippines. Rizal was filled with righteous indignation at the exploitation of the natives by the Chinese traders and appealed to the local residents to boycott the Chinese shops. He also opened a small sarisari store to compete against the Chinese. In the same article, he points out that Ambeth Ocampo notes, despite his Chinese ancestry, the continental Rizal harbored anti-Chinese feelings because of a Chinese sari-sari store. Okay. There in Rizal's article, The Great Dapitan Stocking Market, we know that Rizal had an unfortunate run-in with the sari-sari store because the priest decreed that women should attend mass in shoes and stockings. So they were buying from Chinese merchants. Then Rizal sold his own stocks. So one way to look at it is that Rizal was angry because he was in competition with the Chinese and he wasn't able to sell his wares, whereas the Chinese had the Chinese stocks were sold out. However, Nick Joaquin points out that the Chinese, and I quote, because Chinese financiers had a strong stranglehold on native agriculture, Rizal set up a cooperative association of Dapitan farmers, a pioneer in economic nationalism. Those who now dismiss Rizal as a bourgeois champion of bourgeois interests should here note how he ignored even his ethnic roots to champion Philippinism, the small traders or the peasants. So now we need to ask ourselves whether he was angry at these Chinese merchants because they were Chinese or because of their practices. So we cannot generalize. We cannot generalize and say just because one Chinese person is not ethical, that all Chinese are the same. So, but does Rizal identify himself as Chinese? On December 29th, Rizal was on trial for rebellion. On 29th December, Judge Dominguez went to Fort Santiago to notify Rizal officially that he was found guilty of rebellion and sentenced him to death. And we quote, when the document was shown him, he drew attention to the fact that he was incorrectly described as a Chinese mestizo, saying that he was an Indio puro or pure Indio. So no modifications were made on the notice of judgment. The next day, he was executed and fired upon by Indios. Fired upon by Indios, and he was given a mercy shot. When he died, then a band played, and it was a celebration. Bit strange. This is from Asuncion Lopez Rizal, her book entitled Indio Bravo, The Story of Jose Rizal. Rizal said, let us wear the name Indio as our badge of racial pride. Let us make the Spaniards revise their concept of the Indio. We shall become Indios Bravos. So in the end, he would rather refer to himself as Indio. But not only that, he wanted us to reclaim the term and prove that we are a good people and that we should be proud of our heritage. In conclusion, I would like to say that I do not think that I disagree with the position that Alfonso Ang has taken. Rizal was not anti-Chinese per se, not all Chinese in general. He was against certain practices. And if you find that something is wrong, shouldn't you reject these kinds of behavior? Remember that Rizal wanted to show Filipinos what was wrong with our society, and that included the Filipino, some attitudes of certain Filipinos as shown in his characters in the novel. But what I would like to leave us with is the idea that we should confront our anti-Chinese sentiments and biases, because we have to learn from Rizal's vision, whether or not he is the main idea of why we should appreciate Rizal is because of his ideas, and he tried to show us the way. He told us that education was important. He showed us that if something is unjust, then we should fight and rebel against it. The thing is, we have not learned from Jose Rizal, and I think that they wanted Jose Rizal to be Spanish mestizo because that is because the colonizers were the ones in power, and even Filipinos deny our heritage. We always say, I am part Chinese, part Portuguese, part something else, and then maybe a quarter Filipino. But I always say we are not, we want to be Spanish, but we actually are not. And if we, you know how much Spanish blood we have? If a mosquito bites us, then there goes all of our Spanish blood. So I would like to conclude and say that Jose Rizal, with all his flaws, is somebody that we have to still admire, and his work is a subversive work because he broke the silence and showed us that there is a better way to live, and that we have to be proud, and we have to be proud Filipinos or proud Indios. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I would like to stop share and conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Arboleda for your very informative presentation with so many wonderful pictures and video presentations, and also very good message about distinguishing the practice of individual from your, general judgment of the whole race and whole country. That's a good lesson, good message we need to learn, especially important today. And now we would like to invite Professor Yu Minbao Yu to join the conversation, please.
Okay, thank you, Winston. Thank you, Pia, for your very informative and rich presentation. and for inviting me to engage in this dialogue with you. I, of course, also come to this topic not as a historian, but as somebody who has a research interest in the Chinese diaspora, and mostly in terms of the representation of Chinese diasporas in film and literature. And I've mostly focused on North America and Europe, so I haven't really done any work on Southeast Asia. But I have read some of the works of famous scholar and historian Wang Gengwu, who's well known for having written extensively on the history of Chinese migration, mostly in Singapore and Malaysia. And it is very well known, I think, that in most Southeast Asian countries where Chinese migrated to, at some point or other in history, we can find records of anti-Chinese sentiments, movements, and policies that existed. And I think you showed the first slide of the city space in Manila where the Chinese live, and that was walled, right? So that's a really, really good example. So, and due to that fact, I think heard phrase that the Chinese in Southeast Asia are considered the Jews of Asia. So my comments and questions will focus on asking you to provide maybe a little bit more background information on the context of the debate surrounding Rizal's Chinese ancestry, and which might help me to better understand your conclusion. Right? So my first part of the first part of my question actually is about his Chinese lineage. So I recall the slide that you showed, and it seems like his great-great-grandfather was Chinese, right? Right? Is that correct? Great-great-grandfather, he was like that.
Yes, all of them were Chinese.
Oh, okay. But I thought he married first, right? Later on, I think, was it his grandfather or his father who married a mestizo? But his great-grandfather married Chinese. But anyway, my question actually has more to do with a little bit, if you know, I know you're not a historian, but just sort of general information, the history of Chinese migration to the Philippines. I think a lot of people might think it's a fairly recent, thing, but I think I read somewhere, actually, there are records of Chinese migration to the Philippines that date back to the 9th century. Is that correct? Do they go as far back as that? Mm-hmm.
Well, my reference would only be we did a Pinoy food stories, and we had a segment on Chinese food and its influence on the Philippines, and they were, I only know they were here before the Spaniards arrived, and therefore maybe they have an answer in the chat, but yeah. Therefore, but the problem was they didn't come as like colonizers the way the Spaniards came, and yes. They tried to integrate with the locals, but most of the time they were segregated, but they were necessary evil because they were essential workers. So Rizal's ancestors worked in Intramuros, paving the roads. So even Intramuros, which we think is a Spanish city, is the architecture, the paved roads was Chinese technology, and they only put in Spanish elements because the workers were Chinese. So the Chinese were being segregated, but they were important. And they were the only ones, when Intramuros became a walled city, they were the only ones who could come in and out, and because they were traders and workers. But because they were considered outcasts, the bias against the Chinese back then, and sometimes even now, has remained.
Yeah. Okay. I really agree with your interpretation of some of these quotes that try to make Rizal sound as if he was anti-Chinese, when in fact I think what came through in the quotes, and particularly I think you read the letter that he wrote to his mother, but I think there is another one that I read that Austrian scholar Ferdinand Blumentritt quotes, right? And that shows actually that his comments were much more directed they were much more an expression of his political beliefs. In other words, he was against this exploitation, right? Rather than, right? But what is interesting here, and this is just, I want your thoughts more of a comment. And I think it's also, and this goes back to the second slide you showed about the social hierarchy, right, in the Philippines, right? It makes it looks as if this is a sort of a racial, ethnic hierarchy, when in fact, I think it probably has much more to do with class, right? And this goes back to what I said earlier, this infamous phrase that the Chinese, when they migrated to Southeast Asia, quickly assumed, right, or controlled the trade sector, right? And they controlled business, right? And at the same time, there were many documented instances of exploitative practice, right? So what I find interesting, and this is not just in the case of Philippines, but this constant conflation, right, of ethnicity and race, instead of like bringing in and to label it or to say that this is a racial ethnic issue, when in fact it might have as much to do with class issues, right? So it's just a comment that I had. I wondered if you agree with that. Mm-hmm.
Well, the richest people in the Philippines are of Chinese descent. And you know that they are rich because if you go to Chinatown, every other building is a bank. And the Chinese Chamber of Commerce is one of the most important institutions that control our economy. I think it is our sort of like karma, collective karma, because historically, the Chinese were not treated very well. Most of the time, when the communities become very rich, they are burnt down or they're moved around, and they are not permitted to go to they are permitted to go to Binondo only if they convert to Christianity. But the reasons for conversion for Christianity at that time, according to Austin Craig, is not because of a change in their belief, but because they want to they want to marry or for business purposes. And now they are for example, the big malls in the Philippines started in that Chinatown area. It was called Shoe Mart at that time. They were selling shoes. It was a small store, and it became became super malls later on because of the that because Chinese in general have a knack for business, and so now they are wealthy.
Yeah. Okay. All right. You mentioned towards the end of the presentation, right, that we know if Rizal is Chinese or not, right? And the quotes that people usually use and that you showed, right, I think can be interpreted differently, that it's not against Chinese, but against, an expression of his political beliefs, right? But I wonder, this question of whether he identified as Chinese or not, right? I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts, why this question matters, or to whom, right? In other words, but who, it's not so much a question of whether he self-identified or not, but who wants to claim him as Chinese or Filipino, and towards what end, right? And I'm asking this question, right? Because I happened to read in 2018, I think, when Xi Jinping, current Chinese president, went to the Philippines. I think it was in November 2018, right? He actually honored Jose Rizal. And he led a breath-leading ceremony at the Rizal Park in Manila. And then Xi Jinping was even comparing President Duterte, as crazy as it sounds, to Rizal, right? So a tiny detail for the people in the audience who might not know is that Xi Jinping was actually a former governor of Fujian province, right? And most Chinese Filipinos or Chinese in the Philippines who trace the ancestry back to China come from Fujian, right? And in the city of, I think it's Xinjiang, I actually have a slide that I like to show because I think it's really interesting for people to see. Hold a minute, right? They erected, and so I think they erected a statue, monument, right, for Rizal, and it's quite, impressive, right? It looks like, I think, the one that is in, okay. So this is Rizal Shrine in Fujian province. Can anybody see that? And it looks very similar to the one that you showed on one of your slide, right? So this is in Jingjiang city in the province of China, right? So it seems clear, right? And so back to my question, right? It's not so much, I think, we can't determine, right, whether he identified or not. But what is at stake here and for whom, right? So Xi Jinping, I've already showed the Chinese side of it, right? And there is this obvious connection. Can you say a little bit about, from the Filipino side, So who claims him, who wants to claim him, as what's gained by asking this question and why this question keeps coming up?
For me, I think that it's actually for Filipinos. On one hand, you would think that one way to look at it is, okay, so he's Chinese, so it's good for the Chinese community in the Philippines because of his Chinese ancestry. But what I really want, the takeaway is the Filipinos themselves should stop propagating anti-Chinese sentiments, because we are all going to be judged for what we do and say, and not because of our ethnicity. So it really should be for Filipinos, because we shouldn't be racist in that sense, and we are all of mixed race anyway. So we are all of mixed race, and a lot of us, I mean, Corazon Aquino is Chinese, so
right.
So they have contributed a lot to Philippine society, and we shouldn't. My example at the beginning, like, we shouldn't think any less of Rizal if we know that he is Chinese.
Right. No, I totally agree with that, right? But I guess what I was hinting at, and with all of my previous question, right, is precisely this issue. Why is it so difficult to talk about class? When there are actually real class issues here? Why do people constantly, and I think in America we see that all the time as well, it's extremely difficult, I think, to raise issues of class. Everything is mapped onto race. Right? And I would claim that in Europe, for the longest time, it was the other way around, right? Maybe because of Marx or something, but it was so easy to talk about class, but nobody wanted to talk about race, right? So, but in the context of the Philippines, why is it so difficult then to actually address these issues of class or social inequity? It seems to be much easier to talk about race, right? So, as I say, this is not just an issue in the Philippines, you find it in America, but what are the particular, factors that we have to consider in the case of the Philippines? Why does race or ethnicity immediately come to fore or becomes an easy excuse rather than addressing issues of class or social inequity, or maybe,
we tend to avoid issues about class because because historically, what happens to people who try to change question the status quo,
right?
The inequities. So we are. It's not. There are many people who question or who go against issues of class, but it's more obvious to talk about race because of what we want ourselves to be and how we want to identify ourselves. Because even in Hawaii, people do not want to be called Filipinos. Some of us try to hide our Filipino ethnicity, and also we want we want to identify with the ruling class, and that is and at that time it was the Spanish, and that's why we want to be fair, and we buy whitening soap. People have questioned the hierarchy in terms of class. There were many revolts that happened because of that. And even today, we also confront issues about class, because the gap between the rich and poor in the Philippines just becomes larger and larger.
Anyway, good. Thank you so much. We actually have a lot of people who posted interesting comments in the chat, but we also have a lot of questions. So I would like to invite Wensung back, and we should open the floor for the Q&A from the audience, because we have quite a number of questions here. Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you, Minbao, and thank you, Pia. Let's move into the Q&A session now. We do have some very good questions. The first question I received is from, Clement Bautista. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. While Rizal was officially dismissive of Chinese, as noted in his writing, he acted with full knowledge of Chinese influence. For example, his experience in Hong Kong, and even his reluctance to support the armed revolution. Is this true? I would add that he also studied the Chinese history and Chinese historical knowledge of Philippine, to challenge the Spanish claim that there was no culture in this place. So he understands the Chinese history and culture, and he speaks the language. Pia, what do you think of this question?
Sorry, can I read it? Is it in the chat or Q&A?
It is in the Q&A.
Oh.
Q&A answered the question, the first one.
Right. I mean, Rizal read a lot of obviously Rizal would have read a lot about Chinese history. He read everything actually about Zoroastrianism, everything. Yeah, he acted with full knowledge of Chinese influence. That is true. I don't. When he remarks about the Chinese, it is they're individual of. He talks about individuals, not Chinese in general, and so he would not actually reject Chinese, for example, thought or philosophy, and sometimes. And some of the ideas about this were articulated by, for example, a character of Piloso Potasio, who would talk about philosophies in life, and some of them are taken from Chinese philosophy. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I'm not sure if I understood the question. Sorry, Sir Clement.
Okay.
Sir Clem.
Yeah, let's move on. And our second question is from Jamie Flor Cruz, Filipino of Chinese ancestry, aka Chinoy, today also face the same dilemma as Rizal did, how to be critical of unsavory behavior of certain Chinese, especially of recent migrants from the mainland, without being anti-Chinese and feeding into such racial bias. How should Chinoys handle this? What lessons can we draw from history?
Yes, I understand the question. it's like this. For example, I'm Filipino, and if I'm in a foreign place, like for example Japan, and then I see that they are not behaving properly, then I tell them, what are these Pinoys doing, right? And then they tell me I'm anti-Pinoy, which like anti my own race. Which is the same in the Philippines, because there are particular Chinese individuals that don't behave properly. In the same way that if we are here, there are particular white people that
Right.
behave terribly,
Right.
and we have to point, and we don't say we hate all white people or we hate
Right.
all Chinese, but we have to explain why certain behaviors or political stances are unacceptable, or Chinese business practices. Why certain business practices are unacceptable, but that's not because they are Chinese. It's because of their mindset as like business capitalists, capitalists or colonialists, which could happen whatever race you are. I mean, no matter your race, if you're a capitalist, that behavior should be rejected. We have to be anti-capitalist if it oppresses our people. So yeah, of course, there are certain Chinese individuals who behave poorly, in the same way that some Filipinos are horrible. But it doesn't mean all Filipinos are horrible. I don't know if that even answers the question.
That helps a lot. Actually, we have a follow-up question from Jamie Flo Cruz about the origin of this anti-Chinese racial bias. Her question is, what factors are feeding this bias among the Filipinos? Education, upbringing, colonial mentality, and how do we root those out? What efforts or measures can be taken by individuals and institutions to do that? And related to that, we have another participant, Teresa Annie. She relate this to the colonial policy of the Spaniards. Couldn't the racism in Rizal's time attributed more to the colonial divide and rule policy? And the Spaniards deliberately separated the Chinese from the Indios for fear that they may join in a common cause against them. It came true when it was the Chinese mestizo educated illustrators, who led the revolution. I think this is a terrific point. I have this similar opinion that the Spaniards played a very important role in antagonizing, escalating the racial tensions between the Chinese mixed blood and the native people. And they elevated the native people above the Chinese mixed blood, and they separated them in theater and in all kinds of places to prevent the Chinese taking a leading role, the Chinese mixed blood taking a leading role in a revolution against the Spanish control. And this kind of policy has been used in earlier times, right? The Spaniard colonialists, they need Chinese merchant service, need the goods, need access to Chinese market, but they fear that the Chinese merchants, they had higher loyalty toward China and attachment to Chinese culture. They wouldn't be as loyal to the Spaniards as the natives, the Christianized natives. So they encourage them to get married to produce those children of mixed blood, which present another challenge to them. So it's Spaniards' role played a very important part in this. Your opinion, please.
Our biases are historical. I mean, it's based on historical experience, and obviously the Spaniards had a lot to do with this, because they didn't want the Chinese to be integrated into our society to begin with. So we've always had this. Uh, it's like we don't want to touch them. Like don't even go to the Parian. These people are outcast. But the thing is, how could you not? So they are, you don't want them to be part of society, but you need them. But you want the Chinese to be like beneath everybody else. You don't want them to prosper. Okay, so the moment they start to prosper, then they become a threat, and then you obviously, because you want to maintain your power, you want to destroy them and have people have the general population dislike them. But there are many things that we can learn from the Chinese in the Philippines, and from Chinese philosophy in general. And it will be such a shame if we reject that. So part of it should be the education part of our education. And I asked my high school, I asked teachers in high school if they teach their students about Rizal's ancestry, and the answer is still no in some area, generally speaking. So we're still hiding it till today. But because we are having these sorts of conversations, it's now, we have to open it, like reveal the truth, and then from there, learn from this, because we need to we need to reject the colonial ideas, and the only way to do that is to expose them.
Yes, well said. A good message. The next question is from Clement Bautista. Again, is focusing on race or ethnicity versus class differences a form of Philippine scapegoating?
Maybe. It is easier, right? It's easier to just concentrate on race than class. But I don't believe that we don't confront issues about class. I think that we also do it. It's just a little less prominent in our daily conversations, or even in social media. Because what will you say? We don't like we don't like the capitalists or the rich people in the Philippines. You don't know what's going to happen to you if you forward a position like that. It is dangerous, but still we have to say something against the status quo, because it is oppressing. It's oppressing laborers and the peasants in the Philippines. It's still an issue. Well, here's my take. If we only listened to Rizal a long time ago, then maybe we wouldn't have the same problems. We wouldn't be confronting the same problems today. Like when you read the Noli, it's written in 1888, 89. You read it and it's as if it's happening today. So nothing has changed. So why is it that nothing has changed? So maybe we didn't really listen to Rizal and didn't learn from him. This is what I mean by, looking at his vision of what he wanted for us. And that includes like questions about class. And we have to confront it today.
Can I add?
Go ahead, Mingbaw.
Well, first of all, I think, one should not confuse or conflate race with ethnicity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as many people have pointed out, sociologists, that race is actually not a scientific category, right? But it is, it's an argument that it's based on biological determinism, right? And I think whenever you use such an argument, of course, it puts an end to any kind of discussion or analysis, right? Because you're born that way, or it's in your genes. You can't help it, right? That's so, and based and compared to that, right? If you want to make a class argument, of course, it's much more complex. And of course, when you talk about class, you cannot avoid talking about Marxism. And of course, there is a lot of still anti-communist, anti-Marxist thinking around. So people avoid that. So it's easier to say it's race, it's biologically determined, right? But in any case, I just thought it's important to make the distinction between race and ethnicity. And it's actually not the same, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. I have a question. I'm a historian of China, but I don't know much about Southeast Asia and the Philippines in general, in particular. But I find it very interesting that there is such deep-seated anti-Chinese tradition and sentiment, both in the past and nowadays. And nowadays, it's easier to understand because of the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. We don't need to go there, but we need to acknowledge that, which worsened the situation we are talking about. But from a historical point of view, a Chinese and the Chinese people with Chinese blood, they played a critical role in the development of Philippines as a nation, right? Maybe lay the foundation for the middle class of the Filipino society. And also, they play a critical role in the formation of Filipino national identity and in the making of Filipino nation in the 19th century, which is something we haven't talked much about because Rizal himself played a key role and a key contribution in this process, creating a Filipino nation. So how do you evaluate the Chinese and people with Chinese blood, their contribution, their historical role in the Filipino society in the 19th century, and also the contribution to the national identity and state making? I would argue that Rizal wanted to create a feeling of national unity that would transcend regional and class and racial distinctions. So he doesn't want to be called as Chinese mestizos because he wants to be called a Filipino, which was a term monopolized by the Spaniards. Before 19th century. So he wants to bridge the gap between the different race, different region, and different class to create a unified Filipino state and a Filipino society. I think that's the biggest reason for his reservation or dislike of the Chinese identity that was attached to him. What do you think about this?
For me, we cannot deny the contribution of the Chinese, and then now the Chinese Filipinos to Philippine society in general. Not just in business. It's in business. It's in culture. It's in food. They are part of our history. I think if I do the DNA test, I will have Chinese blood. All of us would have. We will all be part Chinese. And it's the same. the Philippines is a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. We have like from north to south different ethno-linguistic groups, and we have to embrace that diversity. And the Chinese is one of those groups. And we owe a lot. Like, look at our food. We owe a lot to the Chinese, and we couldn't have survived without them. But the question is for today, like, how do we look at Filipino Chinese? They're always separate. I know for a fact that like some Filipinos are being discouraged to marry Chinese, and sometimes in the old families in the Philippines, they want you to marry only like if you're Chinese, you marry Chinese. But that's no longer such a big issue today because people intermarry all the time. So I think that it but the as Chinese Filipinos, they are part of us, but I'm not saying that the political situation today doesn't I mean, it will factor in, obviously, with the way we view Chinese, I mean China China as a nation, and how it relates to the Philippines. But our people, I mean, the Chinese Filipinos, they're our people. They are part of us, and we should stop this. We should stop. We should stop the derogatory remarks about the Chinese. It's the same. Like if you say like all women are, I don't know, all women are dumb or something. It's not a. We have to confront these sorts of biases, because then we cannot move on and really build a nation that is enlightened in that sense.
Great, thank you very much. We have time for one more question. And this question is from Peter QRC. Is Filipino disbelief in Rizal's Chinese ancestry a difficulty in seeing Rizal's re-evaluation of the Indio, raising it up in terms of the Spanish race hierarchy as originating from a non-Indio body? Is the instability between an aspirational Indio with greater rights and racial hybridity and the biological Indio pride only for one's own race? But instead of changing colonial hierarchy, did we just get a new American-inflected racial one?
I think, well, that's very complicated for me, but here's my thing. If we don't accept that he's Chinese, first of all, we have to, know he's Chinese. He was Chinese. We have to accept that he was Chinese, even if he didn't identify as that. And from there, begin to see that it actually, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but that doesn't matter. That is the least of our concerns. And what we need to see is, what we need to do is embrace our multicultural identities. As Filipino people, we are of mixed race. We are multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-everything, multicultural, and so I think it will have to begin there, rather than we keep denying. I think the problem is that our denial. We want to deny what is actually staring us in the face. We cannot I don't know, redesign his DNA or something. It was funny. One time there was talk that they were going to exhume his body and then do run a DNA test on Rizal. And then I thought to myself, what? They'll only find out that he is Chinese. What are they still doing? And what does it matter? You know? But yeah, so I think that the more we talk about it, the more we know that he is Chinese. Later on, it will become a non-issue. We will have to talk about his ideas, what he wanted for the Filipino nation. In the same way that if we are Filipinos here in Hawaii or in America, later on it really will depend on what we do, how we act, what difference we made in the world. And they will not say, you know, you are Filipino, you cannot do this. You are Chinese, you cannot do this. Or you did this because you are Chinese or because you are Filipino. We will be judged by what we do, what we leave behind for our community, and we should not perpetuate a culture of hatred or discrimination. That is not the way forward. It has to be one of acceptance and actually unity as a nation. I think Filipinos, when we are when we're anywhere, we have Filipinos have a problem with being united. You know, I'm Cebuano. I don't want to associate with the, you know, Ilocano or something. This is and Chinese people are part of that too. Like I am Filipino. I don't want to associate with the Filipino Chinese, but we are stronger together. I think.
Well, thank you very much. What a great message, especially meaningful and important in these days of racial tension and conflict and social instability all over the world, especially in the United States. So your comments about the importance of unity and the difficulty in Philippines with this kind of unity, I think it can be said about, you know, China at the turn of the 20th century. That's what the founding father of Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen, tried to do, unify the whole nation, right? He famously said that Chinese people are like a stash of potatoes. We need to reunite with each other to create a new China, build a new Chinese people. I think what Rizal was trying to do is the same, building a new Filipino nation and people and state. Thank you very much, Professor Aboleta and Professor Min Baoyu, for your very informative talk and for sharing with us your great insights and expertise. And many thanks as well to our audience for submitting so many interesting comments and questions. And before you go, a quick reminder that we have another event coming up on February 16th. Professor Jian Zhou from the Scheidner College of Business will make a presentation on China's audit firms. We hope you can join us again. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you next time. Happy New Year. Bye-bye.
Happy New Year. Thank you.